What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the neurobiology of traumatic brain injury from a survey standpoint. And I'm going to actually see if how much I can ask you guys in terms of what you know and don't know about some of the basic neurobiological response to just injury to the central nervous system. And then I'm going to try to wrap it up in about 35 minutes. And then that way you guys can ask me questions if you want. If we want to go into a particular depth on one particular area, I can do that as well. So please don't hesitate to interrupt me if you want. So I have no disclosures. The only money I get is from the state of California, from federal grants. So that what I do for a living, you guys pay for with your taxes. So you don't need to worry about anything in terms of disclosures. The traumatic brain injury, when you compare it to other diseases, it's a remarkable problem in the United States. About 1.5 million Americans. About 800,000 of them are going to go to the hospital. About 600,000 to 500,000 are going to be severe. And we're going to lose a large portion of those for long-term deficits or injury. It's about a $60 billion deficit for the United States. And the way that funding goes, it's not a very politically correct disease to get money because most of these people are young, between the ages of 16 and 26. They're not big political donors right now. They don't have a big political agenda. So it's very hard to generate money from NIH for that. And we run about $57 per case compared to the other cases per person for different types of diseases. There's a continuum of brain injury that you need to consider about. People have thought that brain injury is different whether you're talking about a mild concussion or a moderate injury or a mild injury or severe injury. And most neuroscientists and most neurosurgeons and neurologists and people that deal with traumatic brain injury consider it more than a continuum. And what we do is we make a really big mistake by considering it as one organ. As was described by the case presented today, there are areas of the brain which are more damaged than other parts. So this continuum can be regionally as well as temporally related to the site of the injury. The first thing that you need to understand in traumatic brain injury is that it is much different than other types of diseases or disorders in the central nervous system, primarily that of stroke is a good example. It is a biomechanical load, and a lot of people forget that. When you see athletes, when you see concussions that occur on the National Football League or the National Hockey League or baseball, you know immediately that the brain has been jostled and moved at a certain distance and a certain velocity. Well, General Motors worked this out with Ford and everybody else, trying to come up with the appropriate restraint system for cars to figure out how fast the deployment of a bag or how much restraint needs to be employed so that you can restrict the amount of work that the brain is involved in exposed to during an accident. Notice I said work and not acceleration or deceleration or rotation. Work is force over distance. And it's the amount of work that the brain is imposed upon that actually causes the type of injury that you would consider as a closed head injury or a torquing type of head injury. This is data that was collected many years ago by Tom Gennarelli when he was at the University of Pennsylvania. And it simply indicates that this is a model of the human brain. And if you look at the peak acceleration or peak deceleration, you can see how the brain is contorted from an acceleration-deceleration type of an injury. The other thing is if you look at the top left, there's the arrows that indicate how the cortex actually moves around the white matter. So unlike the other organs in the brain, other organs of the body, the brain does not move uniformly. It moves in different angles and at different velocities depending on the tissue that you're looking at. So white matter has a different rigidity than gray matter. And different organs, different loci in the brain have different rigidities. So the brain stem has a different type of biomechanical compression because of where it's located versus the cortex. In a side injury, you'll see the cortex actually move in a circular fashion clockwise that's adjacent to the point of insult. And if you look at these particular arrows, if you look at the corpus callosum in this particular model, you can see that, in fact, the corpus callosum gets stretched in these types of side impact injuries, not just pushed to one side or next to one side. And that particular type of stretching has been called to result in what we commonly have referred to over the years as diffuse axonal injury. It has been a fallacy that this has been due to stretching or tearing the tissue. This is not the case. The axons are stretched, and the diffuse axonal injury occurs over time. It doesn't occur at the moment of injury. Penetrating head injuries, which is where the case was presented today, well, what's the percent of mortality of head injuries across different age groups when you look at all pediatric falls, assaults, or gunshot wounds? And gunshot wounds typically have the highest amount of mortality when you talk about older individuals. So over the age of 25, they have exceptionally high degree of mortality. But it's interesting, when you look at the time of injury in terms of age, it's almost uniform. It doesn't make any difference how young you are or how old you are. The chances of you having a gunshot wound or an open head injury are pretty common across the United States. So you've already seen a clinical case study or examples of a gunshot wound. So a gunshot wound has a biomechanical load that's induced by a bullet. And the bullet has a caliber to it. Caliber has to do with the types of diameter. It also has to do with whether it's a snub nose or a pointed nose, like an AK-47 or a .22 caliber, which this is a .22 caliber accidental discharge from 10 feet. The further distance you go, the less work the bullet has in terms of producing an injury, the more chances that it will stay within the skull. Sometimes you'll see individuals that will have a gunshot wound where the bullet actually enters the skull but never leaves it. Well, here's an example of a biomechanical event from two different types of gunshot wounds. One is a 25 millimeter full metal jacket, and the other is a 5 millimeter hollow point. The bullet itself will make a track, but when it goes through the brain tissue, it actually causes, much like you can think of it as a sonic boom as it follows through the tract of the brain. And it causes a diffuse derangement of tissue, much similar to the type of a biomechanical load on the brain as it travels through the brain. That's why you don't get a nice clean hole. That's why when you do your CT studies or your MR studies, you see this remarkable amount of damage, even from a simple tract of a bullet wound. So if you know the caliber of the bullet, or you know if it's a snub nose, you can begin to predict how big the type of damage you're going to be looking at when it goes through the cortex and white matter. So there's a real problem when you see patients or you see family members after any type of head injury. And that problem is, how do you answer a particular question? And the question that I used to get asked a lot when I was doing the consenting for our Brain Injury Research Center Burke patients was patients and family members would ask me, how far back will my loved one come? Will they be like they were before? And that's the basic principle of recovery function that we've dealt with for the last 50 years. And since the last 25 years or 30 years that I've been interested in this phenomenon. So the concept is that once you have a certain level of function. You have an injury that occurs, you have a loss of function, and the question is, can you return back to where you were before?